The sun was shining brightly over the historic royal palace, where hundreds of tourists gathered to watch the famous royal guards on duty. Among them stood Corporal Daniel Mensa, a strong and disciplined guardsman in his polished red uniform and tall black hat. His face was serious, his posture perfect. He had trained for years to earn his place among the Queen's Guard, and he took his duty seriously. Tourists admired the guards, taking pictures and watching them stand without moving, no matter what happened around them. Some people even tried to make them laugh, but the guards never reacted. They were trained to be still and professional at all times. Among the crowd, a tall man in a Hawaiian shirt and sunglasses smirked. His name was Roger Whitman, a tourist from another country. He was loud, full of himself, and thought he was smarter than everyone else. His wife and teenage daughter stood nearby, looking a little embarrassed by his behavior. Roger chuckled as he whispered to his wife, "Look at this guy, just standing there like a statue. Bet I could make him blink." His wife sighed. "Roger, don't start." But Roger didn't listen. He stepped closer, looking straight at Daniel. "Hey, buddy, can you hear me?" he said loudly, waving a hand in front of Daniel's face. "Are you even real?" Daniel didn't move, didn't blink. His training taught him to ignore troublemakers like this. Other tourists watched, some shaking their heads. A few took out their phones, sensing something was about to happen. Roger laughed. "Come on, man. Say something. What are they paying you for, huh?" His daughter, Lisa, tugged on his arm. "Dad, stop. It's embarrassing." But Roger just grinned and kept going. "Hey, do you even speak English?" he sneered. "Or did they just stick you here for decoration?" Daniel stayed silent, but his jaw tightened slightly. He had faced men like this before, people who thought they could push others around and get away with it. A nearby security guard watched closely, ready to step in if things got worse. Roger turned to the crowd. "See, he won't even flinch. What's the point of having guards if they don't do anything?" Some tourists chuckled nervously, but most looked uncomfortable. This was not funny. It was rude. But Roger wasn't done. He crossed his arms and smirked. "Bet he wouldn't even stop me if I walked right up to the palace." He was wrong. Because the moment he crossed the line, everything changed. Roger's mocking words echoed through the crowd, and a few people nearby started to laugh nervously. But the laughter wasn't because of Daniel. They were laughing at Roger's rudeness. He was becoming more and more arrogant, and Daniel's calm and focused demeanor only seemed to encourage him. With a grin, Roger stepped even closer to Daniel, his shoes scuffing against the cobblestone path. "Look at you, just standing there, all stiff. Do they teach you to be a robot, or is that just your style?" he mocked, shaking his head as though Daniel were some kind of joke. Daniel stood perfectly still, his eyes straight ahead. He knew the importance of his job. Being a royal guardsman wasn't just about wearing a uniform. It was about respect for the history, the people, and the role he had been trusted with. And he wasn't going to let anyone destroy that. But Roger was relentless. He took another step forward, getting too close for comfort. "Come on, smile. Show us you're human," Roger said with a laugh, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tourists to hear. Some of them stared at him, but no one stepped in. They were all too nervous to say anything to this rude tourist. The more Daniel stood there, the more Roger seemed to think this was some kind of game. He even mimicked Daniel's stance, bending his legs and pretending to hold a rifle in a clumsy way. He was mocking the guards and acting as if it were all just a joke. He looked around, clearly enjoying the attention, and said, "Is this what you do all day? Stand like a statue and get paid for it?" Roger's wife rolled her eyes, clearly embarrassed by her husband's behavior, but she said nothing. Lisa, their daughter, tugged on her dad's sleeve. "Dad, please, let's just go. This is ridiculous." But Roger waved her off, not even noticing how his actions were affecting the people around him. Still, Daniel stood tall, his face locked in that serious expression. No matter what Roger said or did, he would not break character. He was trained for moments like this, trained to ignore insults, distractions, and rudeness. Roger, getting more frustrated, tried to get even closer, now standing right in front of Daniel, practically in his face. "You're not going to say anything. Not even when I'm right here." He leaned forward, almost daring Daniel to respond. The crowd around them grew more uncomfortable. Some people were now recording the scene, and others whispered to each other, their eyes flicking between Daniel and Roger. Daniel's silence was growing harder for Roger to bear. He couldn't believe this guardsman wasn't reacting. He had never seen anyone stay so calm under such pressure. But there was one thing Roger didn't understand. This wasn't just about ignoring him. It was about something much deeper. Suddenly, with one more taunting smirk, Roger raised his hand, ready to push Daniel on the shoulder. He was about to cross the line. And when he did, that's when everything changed. Roger took a step back, grinning. His confidence was growing. He'd been pushing Daniel's buttons for what felt like ages, and the guardsman still hadn't reacted. To him, it was almost like Daniel was just a walking statue, something to laugh at, something to mock. But Roger didn't understand the kind of strength it took to stand still and ignore the insults. "You must really think you're something special, huh?" Roger sneered, his voice loud enough for the nearby tourists to hear. "You're just a guy in a funny uniform. It's not like you're actually protecting anyone." His words sliced through the air, and some tourists looked away uncomfortably, but most of them just stood there, watching in silence. Everyone knew this wasn't right, but no one had yet stepped forward to say something. It felt like everyone was waiting for Daniel to break his stoic stance or show some kind of reaction. Roger was now pacing in front of Daniel, clearly enjoying the attention. "I mean, look at this guy," he continued, his arms outstretched like he was making a joke. "Are you seriously telling me you're part of the Royal Guard? I don't buy it. This is a joke." He laughed, hoping someone would join him, but the crowd was too polite to say anything. Daniel didn't move a muscle, not even to blink. His eyes were locked ahead, focused on his duty. He knew his role wasn't just about standing still. It was about showing honor to the job, the palace, and the people who trusted him to protect something bigger than himself. Roger, growing even bolder, took another step closer to Daniel. He was only a few inches away now. "What are you going to do, huh? Give me a ticket. Tell me to leave," Roger said, his tone mocking. His hands were on his hips, like he was daring Daniel to do something. "You really don't know how to have fun, do you?" Roger said with a sarcastic chuckle. "If I were you, I'd at least smile. Maybe try to make people laugh, instead of just standing there like you're frozen." But Daniel remained as still as ever, his jaw tight. He wasn't just ignoring Roger's words, he was choosing not to let them affect him. He was trained for moments like this, and he knew that reacting to insults would only make things worse. It was better to stay calm, stay professional. Roger looked around, hoping someone would laugh at his jokes or join in on his little game, but no one did. The tourists were starting to feel uncomfortable, realizing that Roger had crossed the line. He was no longer just joking. He was disrespecting someone who had earned the right to stand there, quiet and dignified. "I don't know why you're so serious. You should lighten up, buddy," Roger said, his smile fading a bit as he realized he wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. "Do you even know how to have fun?" Still, Daniel remained completely silent. He had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let this man turn his duty into a circus. But Roger, pushing farther, decided to go one step further, to make his point by getting closer and being even more irritating. He raised his hand again, this time to poke Daniel's shoulder, thinking it would break his composure. What happened next was something Roger didn't expect, and neither did anyone watching. Roger stood right in front of Daniel now, his face full of frustration. The crowd had grown quieter. They could all sense something was about to happen, and even though most of them wanted to stay out of it, they couldn't look away. "I can't believe you're still doing this," Roger muttered, his eyes scanning Daniel's face, looking for some sign of weakness, some flicker of emotion. But Daniel remained still, his eyes forward, his face serious, as always. Roger's grin began to fade. He was beginning to feel like he wasn't getting the reaction he expected. The more Daniel stayed silent, the angrier Roger got. He stepped back, then forward again, getting so close that Daniel could feel the heat of his breath. "All right, that's it," Roger suddenly shouted. "I'm done with this." With no warning, Roger reached out and shoved Daniel's shoulder. The push was hard enough to make Daniel wobble slightly. But he didn't move. His body stayed firm, his posture straight. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, and didn't take a step back. It was like Roger had tried to push a wall. The tourists around them gasped. Some of them stepped back in surprise, their eyes wide as they realized what had just happened. It was a bold move on Roger's part, one that crossed the line from rude to outright disrespectful. Daniel's grip on his rifle tightened, though he didn't move an inch. The fact that he didn't react right away was all the more shocking. His calmness in the face of provocation only made Roger's actions seem even more out of place. Roger, now even more certain that he could get away with whatever he wanted, looked around to see if anyone was going to stop him. No one was stepping in. In fact, most people were now avoiding eye contact, not wanting to be part of the drama. Roger's wife and daughter were still standing by, but they said nothing. They both looked uncomfortable, as if they knew this situation was getting worse. "What's the matter? Are you too scared to move?" Roger taunted, his voice full of scorn. "I'm not afraid of you." But Daniel's patience was running thin. He knew he had to handle this carefully, especially since he was on duty. He had been trained to maintain control in the face of anger and disrespect. His breathing slowed, and his mind stayed focused. Then, in a calm but firm voice, Daniel spoke. "Step back now," he commanded, his voice low but clear. The words were sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. Roger, caught off guard by the authority in Daniel's voice, hesitated for just a moment. He hadn't expected this kind of reaction. Most people would have either yelled back or tried to walk away. But not Daniel. He wasn't intimidated. Roger smirked again, trying to laugh it off. But before he could do anything else, something incredible happened. Without warning, Daniel moved in an instant, his body springing forward with the speed and precision that only someone who had been trained could achieve. He didn't attack Roger physically, but he made it clear that he was not to be disrespected any longer. The moment Daniel moved, everything seemed to slow down. It wasn't a violent response, but it was so sudden and precise that it left everyone around him frozen. Roger, who had been so confident just moments before, found himself stumbling back as Daniel raised his rifle, holding it in a defensive position that made it clear this was not a joke anymore. The crowd gasped, and a few people stepped back, instinctively afraid of what might happen next. But Daniel didn't raise his weapon to strike. He raised it to defend, to establish that he wasn't going to allow any further disrespect. He wasn't going to let this ignorant tourist think he could push him around. Roger blinked, his arrogant smile slipping away. He had thought that because Daniel didn't react before, he could keep going, but now he was facing something much bigger than he had imagined. Daniel wasn't just a soldier standing in a uniform. He was a professional who had been trained for situations like this. With a clear and powerful voice, Daniel spoke again, his words full of authority. "Step away now." The force behind his words shocked Roger. The strength wasn't in the volume, but in the confidence and control that Daniel's voice carried. This wasn't the sound of someone who was uncertain or afraid. This was the voice of a man who had faced challenges before and knew how to handle them. Roger's hands started to tremble slightly. For the first time, he wasn't so sure of himself. He tried to laugh it off, to pretend like he wasn't intimidated, but the look on Daniel's face made it clear. This wasn't a joke. The tourists around them were no longer just watching. They were starting to record the scene on their phones, capturing everything. It was as if they had all suddenly realized that this wasn't just about a rude tourist and a guardsman. It was about respect and the consequences of testing someone who had earned their position. Daniel's gaze never wavered. He didn't blink. He didn't move a muscle, but his presence was enough to make Roger reconsider his actions. For a split second, Roger stood still, staring at Daniel, unsure of what to do next. He had underestimated this guardsman, and now he was beginning to see just how wrong he had been. "This is your last warning," Daniel said quietly, his grip on the rifle steady. "Move back, or I will call for security." The warning was clear. There was no need for further words. Daniel had done everything by the book, exactly how he had been trained. He had shown patience, professionalism, and above all, restraint. The tourists around them were now more focused on Roger, some even shaking their heads in disbelief at his behavior. Roger opened his mouth, as if to say something more, but then he stopped. He finally realized that pushing Daniel any further wouldn't just make him look foolish. It could lead to consequences he wasn't ready to face. For the first time, Roger took a step back, his eyes flicking nervously toward the surrounding tourists. He could feel the stares and the judgment, and it made him uncomfortable. The power of Daniel's professionalism had broken through his bravado. As Roger stepped away, Daniel's stance remained firm. His job wasn't just about standing still. It was about maintaining control, showing strength through silence, and standing up for what was right. And in that moment, he had done just that. As Roger stepped back, the tension didn't just fade away. It seemed to grow even stronger. For a brief moment, it felt like time itself had slowed, and everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. But the situation was far from over. Roger's smug expression had vanished completely. He was no longer standing tall and proud like he had before. Instead, his shoulders slumped, and his face showed something that was a mix of anger and embarrassment. The power had shifted. Daniel had proven that he wasn't someone to be messed with, and Roger was feeling the weight of his mistake. Before Roger could say another word, palace security guards stepped forward, moving quickly through the crowd. One of them was the officer who had been watching from the sidelines. Noticing the escalation, his eyes locked on Roger, and he gave a quick signal to the other officers. Without hesitation, they surrounded Roger, blocking any chance of escape. "You've been warned. Now you need to leave," one of the security guards said firmly, pointing toward the exit. Roger opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. His words were stuck in his throat, his bravado completely gone. He had crossed the line, and there was no going back now. The tourists around them were already whispering, exchanging looks. Some of them had caught the entire scene on camera, while others simply stared, wide-eyed, at the unfolding situation. Daniel stood to the side, his posture still perfect, watching as the security guards handled the situation. He didn't have to say another word. He had done his part. Roger's wife and daughter stood silently behind him. His daughter, Lisa, was red-faced with embarrassment. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground. Roger's wife, who had been trying to warn him earlier, now gave him a disappointed look. Her arms were crossed, and her face was full of frustration. "Dad, you're making this worse," Lisa whispered, looking at the floor, clearly upset. Roger didn't respond. He didn't have anything to say that could fix this now. His rude behavior had put him in the spotlight, and it wasn't the kind of attention he wanted. As the security guards continued to escort Roger away, the crowd started to shift. Some of them seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, as if the situation had finally been resolved. Others stood in stunned silence, still processing what had just happened. The officer who had been watching approached Daniel with a nod of respect. "You did well, sir. Thank you for handling this situation calmly." Daniel simply nodded, his expression still serious but proud. "It's my duty," he said quietly. He wasn't looking for praise. He just wanted to return to his post, to continue doing the job he had trained so hard for. Meanwhile, Roger was led away by the security team, his head hanging low. He was humiliated. He had come to the palace as a tourist, expecting a fun experience, but he had only succeeded in making a fool of himself. The news would spread quickly. The footage of Roger's rude behavior and his eventual removal by security would be all over social media by the evening. The public reaction was already building. Some people were expressing sympathy for Daniel and praising his professionalism, while others were mocking Roger for his foolishness. The days following the incident at the royal palace were full of attention for Daniel, but not in the way most people would expect. Though the video had gone viral, and he was being praised for his composure, Daniel wasn't interested in fame. He wasn't someone who sought attention. Instead, he had simply done his job the way he had been trained to, with pride and professionalism. Soon, the news outlets wanted to interview him. "How does it feel to be a hero?" one reporter asked as she sat across from him, a camera rolling. Daniel smiled politely but shook his head. "I'm not a hero," he replied calmly. "I just did my job. It's what I'm here for. I was trained to be a guard, not a celebrity." The reporter seemed surprised by his humility, but Daniel's answer was honest. He wasn't looking for praise or recognition. He didn't need to be called a hero. All he needed was to do his duty the best way he could. His answer was simple, but it left an impression on those watching. Later that week, Daniel's commanding officer praised him for how he handled the situation. "You did exactly what we expect from a royal guardsman," the officer said, shaking his hand. "You represented not just the Queen, but the entire country with dignity. That's something we don't see enough of today." Daniel gave a small nod, feeling the respect from his superior, but he didn't let it go to his head. He had worked hard to be in this position, and he knew his job wasn't about being recognized. It was about doing what was right. Meanwhile, Roger's life had taken a different turn. The viral video had put him in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. It wasn't just the internet or social media that had noticed, it was his workplace too. His bosses had seen the video, and they didn't like what they saw. "We do not condone the behavior that was displayed," his employer stated publicly. "Roger Whitman's actions do not reflect the values of our company, and we are taking appropriate action." Roger was fired from his job. The shame he felt was overwhelming. He had lost his position, and it seemed like his entire reputation had been damaged. The very thing he had tried to enjoy, a day at the royal palace, had turned into a public embarrassment. But Roger's punishment wasn't just losing his job. He had to deal with the disappointment from his family and friends. His daughter, Lisa, had tried to warn him, and now she couldn't help but feel angry with him. "Dad, I told you to stop," she said quietly, her voice full of frustration. This could have all been avoided. Roger didn't know how to respond. He had let his ego get the best of him, and now he was facing the consequences. He thought back to the moment when he had pushed Daniel. He wished he had never done it. On the other hand, Daniel had earned the respect of countless people, not just for his actions that day, but for how he handled the situation after it was over. He had remained calm, humble, and professional throughout. The videos continued to circulate, and each time someone watched, they saw someone who didn't let disrespect or provocation control his behavior. Daniel had been a model of strength, not in the way people usually think of strength, but in his ability to keep his composure and his self-respect. In the end, it was clear that this wasn't just about a man in a uniform standing still. It was about the power of respect, the importance of maintaining your values no matter what, and the strength to not be moved by the ignorant actions of others. Roger's life had changed completely in the week following the incident. The viral video had made him famous, but for all the wrong reasons. It wasn't just the loss of his job that weighed on him. It was the fact that his behavior had been seen by so many people, and they had all judged him for it. The disrespect he had shown toward Daniel, and by extension, the entire royal guard, had cost him far more than he could have imagined. As he sat at home, scrolling through the hundreds of comments about the incident, he couldn't help but feel a sense of regret. "What was I thinking?" he muttered to himself. "I should have just kept my mouth shut." His friends and family had tried to comfort him, but it didn't change the reality. His daughter, Lisa, had been particularly quiet, and he could feel her disappointment. "I've let everyone down," Roger thought. He hadn't just let himself down. He had let his family down too. On the other side, Daniel had returned to his normal duties. The attention he had received from the media had calmed down, and the buzz around the incident had slowly faded. But the way people treated him had changed. People now greeted him with respect and admiration, not just for his role as a royal guardsman, but for how he handled the situation with such composure. One afternoon, while Daniel was standing on duty, a tourist approached him. The man smiled and said, "I saw that video. You were amazing. You showed true strength out there. You handled it better than I ever could have." Daniel gave a small nod, acknowledging the compliment, but he didn't seek praise. "Thank you," he said, keeping his tone polite but neutral. "I was just doing my job." But in truth, Daniel knew the lesson that had been learned wasn't just about doing his job. It was about showing the world the true meaning of strength. Strength wasn't about how loud you could yell or how hard you could push back. It was about control, patience, and respect, for yourself and for others. Meanwhile, Roger had slowly started to realize the same thing. His friends had begun to reach out, and he had some heart-to-heart talks with them. "You have to earn respect," one of his close friends had said. "It's not about mocking others or being rude. True strength is about knowing when to step back, when to apologize, and when to show some humility." It was a hard lesson, but one that Roger had learned too late. Over time, he started to reflect on what had happened and what he could have done differently. He understood now that his actions had been out of line, but he was also beginning to understand how to become a better person, someone who could earn respect by showing humility, not by demanding it. As the weeks passed, Daniel's role as a royal guardsman remained unchanged. He continued to stand in his position, watching over the palace with the same pride and dedication he always had. He was still the same man, calm, strong, and dignified. The world had seen what he was capable of when faced with disrespect, and they had learned that true strength comes from within. And for Roger, the lesson he had learned wasn't just about his behavior toward others. It was about learning how to move forward, how to be a better person, and how to respect those who deserve it. Roger's life had changed completely in the week following the incident. The viral video had made him famous, but for all the wrong reasons. It wasn't just the loss of his job that weighed on him. It was the fact that his behavior had been seen by so many people, and they had all judged him for it. The disrespect he had shown toward Daniel, and by extension, the entire royal guard, had cost him far more than he could have imagined. As he sat at home, scrolling through the hundreds of comments about the incident, he couldn't help but feel a sense of regret. "What was I thinking?" he muttered to himself. "I should have just kept my mouth shut." His friends and family had tried to comfort him, but it didn't change the reality. His daughter, Lisa, had been particularly quiet, and he could feel her disappointment. "I've let everyone down," Roger thought. He hadn't just let himself down. He had let his family down too. On the other side, Daniel had returned to his normal duties. The attention he had received from the media had calmed down, and the buzz around the incident had slowly faded. But the way people treated him had changed. People now greeted him with respect and admiration, not just for his role as a royal guardsman, but for how he handled the situation with such composure. One afternoon, while Daniel was standing on duty, a tourist approached him. The man smiled and said, "I saw that video. You were amazing. You showed true strength out there. You handled it better than I ever could have." Daniel gave a small nod, acknowledging the compliment, but he didn't seek praise. "Thank you," he said, keeping his tone polite but neutral. "I was just doing my job." But in truth, Daniel knew the lesson that had been learned wasn't just about doing his job. It was about showing the world the true meaning of strength. Strength wasn't about how loud you could yell or how hard you could push back. It was about control, patience, and respect, for yourself and for others. Meanwhile, Roger had slowly started to realize the same thing. His friends had begun to reach out, and he had some heart-to-heart talks with them. "You have to earn respect," one of his close friends had said. "It's not about mocking others or being rude. True strength is about knowing when to step back, when to apologize, and when to show some humility." It was a hard lesson, but one that Roger had learned too late. Over time, he started to reflect on what had happened and what he could have done differently. He understood now that his actions had been out of line, but he was also beginning to understand how to become a better person, someone who could earn respect by showing humility, not by demanding it. As the weeks passed, Daniel's role as a royal guardsman remained unchanged. He continued to stand in his position, watching over the palace with the same pride and dedication he always had. He was still the same man, calm, strong, and dignified. The world had seen what he was capable of when faced with disrespect, and they had learned that true strength comes from within. And for Roger, the lesson he had learned wasn't just about his behavior toward others. It was about learning how to move forward, how to be a better person, and how to respect those who deserve it.